The sky didn't just turn gray. It turned the bruised, sickly color of a deep wound. The air didn't just grow still. It pressed down, heavy and suffocating, holding its breath just before the world exploded. And then the sound came, not distant thunder, but a roar that seemed to tear the very fabric of the atmosphere, followed by rain that hit like flung stones. This was no ordinary storm. This was a fury unleashed. It swallowed the horizon whole, a monstrous gray wave crashing down on the heartland. And he stood watching, an aging farmer, as everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for his entire life, began to vanish beneath a terrifying brown tide. The barn collapsed with sound like a dying beast, a lifetime of labor gone in seconds. Despair threatened to drown him before the water even reached his door. He thought he'd lost it all, his past, his present, his future. But then, through the deafening chaos, a sound reached him thin, fragile, utterly vulnerable, the cry of a single, small life that refused to be silenced. It was a sound that demanded a courage that went beyond reason, beyond age, beyond overwhelming loss. It was a sound that would force an aging farmer into one final, heartbreaking fight against the impossible, a fight for one tiny creature that would leave us all in tears. Silas was cut from the same cloth as the land he worked, tough, weathered, and deeply rooted. His face was a landscape of seasons and struggles, each line etched by sun, wind, and worry. The crow's feet around his eyes crinkled when he smiled, which wasn't often, but genuinely. His hands, thick and powerful despite their age, were permanently stained with soil and marked with the small scars of working with livestock and machinery. He was a man whose life was measured in sunrises over the eastern pasture and sunsets behind the western ridge. 72 years old, his joints protested on cold mornings, and his pace had slowed, but the fire in his spirit, the quiet strength at his core, remained undimmed. His farm was more than property. It was his lifeblood, his legacy. 40 acres of carefully tended fields, a small herd of Angus cattle he knew almost individually, a farmhouse that held the ghosts of shared meals and quiet evenings. It wasn't a show farm. It was a working farm, built on sweat and sacrifice, a testament to generations of resilience. He remembered the great drought of the 80s, when the earth cracked open and he nearly lost everything, surviving on beans and stubbornness. He remembered the market crash that forced him to sell off half his herd just to pay the mortgage, the ache of watching those animals go carving a permanent notch in his soul. Each time, he'd pull back from the brink, relying on an iron will forged by necessity and a quiet faith in the cycles of nature and the promise of a new season. He knew the cost of giving up, and it was higher than any price the market could set. His days followed a predictable, comforting pattern. Up before dawn, the smell of coffee mingling with the cool morning air. Out to feed the cattle, checking on new calves, mending a section of fence frayed by wind or time. The rhythmic work was a meditation, a connection to the earth that sustained him. He wasn't a man who needed much, just his land, his animals, and the quiet satisfaction of a hard day's work done well. He read the sky, knew the language of the wind in the tall grass, felt the subtle shifts in temperature that signaled coming weather. He was a man in tune with his world, a quiet guardian of a way of life that valued perseverance, self-reliance, and a deep respect for the natural order. Life on the farm wasn't easy, but it was honest, it was his, and it held profound, hard-won peace. The stillness that descended that afternoon was wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. It felt like the world was holding its breath, a pressure building behind a terrifying silence. The birds stopped singing. The cattle grew restless, milling near the barn, lowing nervously. Silas felt it too, a prickle of unease that went deeper than just a weather forecast. He checked the sky again, that bruised color spreading, darkening. The wind picked up, not a steady breeze, but sudden, violent gusts that tore leaves from trees and whipped them into frenzies. Then the first drops, large, heavy, splattering like ink on the dry earth. The rain became a deluge within minutes. It wasn't just rain. It was a solid wall of water, driven by a wind that howled like a tormented spirit. The sound on the tin roof was deafening, obliterating all other noise. Silas moved with practiced urgency, securing windows, making sure the back door was bolted. He glanced out at the creek, a peaceful trickle most days. Now it was a brown, churning monster, swelling with horrifying speed, spilling over its banks, consuming the pasture land with an unnatural hunger. He watched in stunned silence as the water spread, swallowing the green fields, submerging fence lines he had just repaired. It raced toward the barn, a wave of muddy destruction. The wind shrieked, a sound of pure malice, tearing at the eaves of the house. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in strobe-like flashes, revealing the horrifying reality of the rising flood. This wasn't a slow inundation. It was a sudden, brutal assault. And then came the sound that froze his blood, a deep, wrenching groan of tortured wood, followed by a cascade of splintering, ripping, tearing. The barn, his grandfather's barn, it listed violently, the wind and water hammering against its aged structure, and then, with a thunderous roar that somehow cut through the storm's fury, it collapsed. Timbers the size of tree trunks snapped like twigs. Walls imploded, the familiar shape dissolving into a chaotic mass of debris, swallowed by the brown floodwaters. Silas stumbled back from the window, a choked cry escaping his lips. The barn gone, the heart of his farm, reduced to wreckage in seconds. He squeezed his eyes shut, a wave of nausea and despair washing over him. The scale of it was unfathomable. The lifetime of work, the animal's shelter within its sturdy walls, the history it held annihilated. It felt like a physical blow, stealing his breath, leaving him aching and hollow. He felt the cold grip of lost tighten around his heart, heavy, suffocating. There was nothing left. He had lost it all. He stood there for a moment, reeling from the blow, the rain hammering against the house, the wind screaming its victory. The water was already higher on the steps outside. Survival instinct screamed at him. Get to the attic. Try to find higher ground. Save himself. Everything else was gone. There was nothing more he could do. But through the terrifying symphony of destruction, through the roar of the wind and the rush of the water and the ache of his breaking heart, he heard it again. A sound that was impossibly small yet vibrantly alive. A high-pitched, desperate bleat, thin and reedy against the storm's fury. It was a calf, one of the newest ones, maybe the little heifer born just a few weeks ago, the one with the white star on her forehead. It was coming from the area where the barn had just collapsed, near the fence line now lost beneath the surge. In that instant, the crushing weight of total loss shifted, replaced by a razor-sharp focus. The farm was gone. The barn was gone. But that was a life. A tiny, vulnerable life caught in the chaos. It was depending on him. And a farmer didn't abandon his animals. Not ever. Not as long as he could draw breath. His aging body was weary, soaked in despair and the chilling spray that seeped through the window cracks. But a different kind of heat ignited within him. A fierce, protective fire that burned away the numbness of shock. Reason argued, the water, the debris, the current, his age, the sheer impossibility of it. But instinct roared louder. Go. That was his calf. It was in danger. He had to go. He moved then, fueled by a primal urgency that bypassed thought. He pulled on his thickest barn jacket, ripped a length of rope from a hook by the door, a farmer's improvisational tool. He didn't bother with waders or boots. There was no time. He threw open the back door, the wind tearing at it, ripping it from his grasp with a violent wrench. The water surged in, a cold, muddy wave that hit him like a physical blow, instantly soaking him to the waist. The shock stole his breath, leaving him gasping. He stepped out into the maelstrom. The current immediately grabbed at his legs, a powerful, unseen force trying to drag him downstream. It was like wading through liquid concrete. Only the concrete was moving, fighting against him, pulling him off balance. He had to plant his feet with deliberate force, leaning into the resistance, using the rope for balance against the pull. The air was thick with the smell of churned earth, flooded fields, and something metallic, chemical, debris from a barn, perhaps. Rain lashed down, stinging his face, blurring his vision. The wind howled, a constant, disorienting roar. And everywhere, the sound of rushing water, a hungry, relentless sound that filled the world. He scanned the swirling brown surface, straining to see, straining to hear. The calves' bleating was clearer now, desperate, closer than he expected, but muffled by the noise. He could see dark shapes bobbing in the water, heartbreakingly, the bodies of other animals taken by the flood. Each one was a fresh wave of grief, a silent accusation of his failure to protect them all. But he couldn't stop. Not now. One was still alive. Debris swirled around him, branches, planks of wood, twisted metal. He stumbled over something submerged, sharp, pain shooting up his leg. He regained his balance, his heart hammering against his ribs, the taste of fear metallic in his mouth. The water was rising rapidly, up to his chest now, making every step an agonizing effort. His clothes, heavy with water, dragged at him, trying to pull him under. The cold was a deep, penetrating ache that seeped into his bones, numbing his fingers, stiffening his joints. He pushed forward, guided by the sound, his eyes scanning the chaotic surface near where the barn had stood. The submerged fence line was marked by a line of turbulent water, a dangerous current indicating unseen hazards. He had to navigate this, pushing against the strongest part of flow. His lungs burned with the effort, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could feel the muscles in his legs trembling with strain. Age was a cruel weight in this fight, slowing him down, making him vulnerable. But he wasn't just relying on physical strength. He was drawing on a lifetime of resilience. He remembered facing down the bank foreclosure notice, the cold dread in his stomach, finding the strength to keep working day after day until the danger passed. He remembered the feel of frostbite in his fingers during a winter storm, the stubborn refusal to come inside until the animals were safe. Every hardship, every moment he had refused to quit, had built this capacity for endurance, this refusal to be broken. He focused on the calf's cry, letting it anchor him, a tiny spark of life in this vast, cold death. He saw it then, huddled precariously close to a tangle of what looked like roofing timbers and twisted wire, barely keeping its head above the swirling water. The little heifer calf, the one with the white star. Her eyes were wide with terror, her body shivering violently. She was trapped, tangled in the wreckage, unable to break free. Her bleating was weak now, a thin, pitiful sound of pure fear and exhaustion. She looked impossibly small, impossibly fragile, against the backdrop of the churning brown water and the wreckage of his farm. A fresh surge of adrenaline, hot and fierce, coursed through him, overriding the cold, overriding the exhaustion. He had to reach her. Now, she was weakening. He was weakening. The distance was maybe 30 yards, maybe less, but it felt like crossing an ocean. The current here was vicious, swirling around the debris, creating eddies that threatened to pull him down, pull her down. He lowered his head, squinting, and pushed forward with renewed urgency. Each step was a brutal fight against the water. He felt the sting of barbed wire snagging at his legs again, tearing through the wet fabric of his trousers, biting into his skin. He ignored it, focusing on the calf. His hands, already raw and cold, brushed against sharp edges of submerged wood, splinters embedding themselves under his fingernails. Pain was a constant companion now, a low thrum beneath the roaring of the storm and the desperate need to reach the calf. He talked to her as he struggled closer, his voice hoarse, barely audible over the storm. "Hold on, little one. Hold on. I'm coming. Just a little further." He wanted his voice to be a comfort, a signal that help was near, a promise in the chaos. He was close now, only feet away. He could see the fine, dark wire wrapped tightly around her hind legs, pinning her against a submerged piece of timber. She thrashed weakly, panic rising in her eyes as he reached her. Her hide was slick and cold beneath his touch. He grabbed hold of her, steadying her, trying to assess the tangle of wire. It was wrapped tight, cutting into her flesh. Barbs bit into his bare hands as he fumbled with the wire, trying to find a way to loosen it, to break it. His fingers were numb with cold, clumsy and unresponsive. The water swirled around them, the current pulling harder here, threatening to rip the calf from his grasp, to pull them both down into the submerged debris. He yanked at the wire, ignoring the sharp bite in his palms, the blood welling up and mixing with the murky water. He twisted, pulled, strained, his muscles screaming in protest. The calf cried out, a sharp, fearful sound as he worked at the wire. He felt a splinter would pierce his hand, deep and painful. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Almost gotcha, he muttered through gritted teeth, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He put his shoulder into it, bracing himself against the current, using his body to shield the calf. He could feel her trembling, her fear mirroring his own. He knew his strength was fading rapidly. The cold was stealing his heat, the exertion stealing his energy. Suddenly, with a final, desperate wrench, a strand of wire snapped. Then another. He pulled again, and the tangle loosened just enough. The calf was free from the snag. But they weren't safe. They were still in the deep, fast-moving water, the current grabbing at the now loose calf. Silas immediately hooked his arm around her chest, pulling her against his side, trying to get a secure hold. She was heavy, exhausted, her legs barely moving in the water. He had to get her back. Getting back was a new kind of hell. Now he was swimming, half walking, fighting the current with a heavy, frightened animal clinging to him. The water seemed deeper, colder. His legs ached, his arms burned, his chest felt tight with the effort. He aimed for the house, the dark shape looming slightly above the water in the distance. He stumbled, his foot catching on something beneath the surface. They both plunged under the cold, muddy water. The shock of immersion stole his breath again. Water filled his nose, his mouth. He choked, coughing, his lungs burning. But he held on a calf with a death grip. Blindly, he kicked, pushed, found solid footing again, surging upwards, breaking the surface, gasping for air. The calf coughed too, a weak, miserable sound, pressing against him. He pushed on, driven by a desperate, primal will. Every muscle screamed in protest. His bleeding hands burned in the cold water. His vision blurred with exhaustion and the driving rain. He thought of the farm, gone. He thought of the other animals, lost. And he clung tighter to this one small life, a stubborn refusal to let the storm take absolutely everything. This calf represented something more than just livestock. She was a piece of hope in a landscape of ruin, a testament to life enduring. The porch steps. He could see them now, barely visible above the water, a darker line against a brown expanse. Safety, just yards away. He used the last reserves of his strength, pushing through the burning in his limbs, the ache in his chest, the cold that permeated his very being. He reached the steps, stumbling, collapsing against a solid structure. He dragged the calf with him, pulling her up onto the first step, then the second, until they were out of the main current, on solid ground, though still surrounded by water. Silas sank onto the steps, leaning back against the house, utterly spent. His body shook uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from the raw, physical exhaustion and emotional release. He held the calf against him, his arms wrapped protectively around her trembling body. The storm was beginning to lose its fury, the wind less vicious, the rain easing slightly. The world was still, dominated by the sound of rushing, receding water. He looked out over the scene of devastation. The water stretched in every direction, brown and indifferent. The remains of his barn were barely visible. Fences gone, fields submerged under a layer of mud. It was gone, all of it. He had fought for one small life while his own world dissolved. Tears, hot and heavy, streamed down his face, mixing with the rain and the mud and the blood from his hands. Tears for the loss, for the pain, for the sheer, heartbreaking scale of the destruction, and tears of profound relief, a deep, shaking gratitude for the warm, small body huddled against him. The calf, sensing his distress, or perhaps just seeking warmth and comfort, nudged its wet head against his chest with a soft, low sound. In that moment, surrounded by ruin, shivering and wounded, Silas felt a flicker of something fragile but fiercely alive. Hope. This little life, saved against all odds, was a testament that not everything had been lost. It wasn't long before the first boat arrived, navigating cautiously through the receding floodwaters. Neighbors, firefighters, emergency responders coming to check on him, knowing his farm was hit hard. They found him there on the steps of his flooded farmhouse, an old man, battered and bleeding, cradling a small, wet calf. The sight stopped him cold. In a landscape of widespread loss and despair, it was an image of quiet courage, of life protected, of a spirit that refused to be broken. Word of Silas and the calf spread quickly as the floodwaters receded, revealing the full, devastating impact. The story of his fight for that one small life became a powerful symbol for the whole community. His farm was a wreck. Mud coated everything. Debris was scattered everywhere. The smell of stagnant water hung heavy in the air. But amidst the mud and the ruin, the little heifer calf, Hope, was always there, a living, breathing testament to Silas's bravery. The days that followed were filled with backbreaking work. But Silas wasn't alone in the mud. Trucks and trailers pulled up his long, muddy driveway. Neighbors arrived with shovels, wheelbarrows, generators, offering food, coffee, dry clothes. They helped him muck out the farmhouse, clear debris, mend fences where they could. People he barely knew showed up, having heard the story, simply wanting to help. It was the American spirit in action, not asking for anything in return, just showing up for a neighbor in need, embodying the strength of community in the face of overwhelming adversity. Silas, sore and exhausted, worked alongside them, his heart heavy with the weight of what was lost, but lifted by the outpouring of support and the persistent, comforting presence of hope. The little calf would follow him around the property as he surveyed the damage, a reminder that life continued, that new beginnings were possible, even from the ashes of devastation. He knew rebuilding would be a monumental task, perhaps too much for a man his age. There would be years of hard work, of facing challenges he hadn't anticipated. But as he looked at Hope, grazing in a small patch of clear ground, healthy and alive because of his choice to risk everything, he didn't feel defeated. He felt tired, yes, but not broken. Silas didn't think of himself as a hero. He was just a farmer who did what he had to do. But his story, the quiet, heartbreaking fight for one small life amidst the loss of everything, resonated deeply. It was a powerful reminder of the quiet courage that resides in ordinary Americans, the unwavering sense of duty, the willingness to sacrifice, not for fame or glory, but for the simple, profound value of protecting the vulnerable. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the enduring power of hope, in a way that even in the face of overwhelming despair, a single act of selfless courage can shine brighter than any storm, proving that the heart of America beats strongest when its people stand together and fight for what truly matters.